Chapter 19, Drifting Toward Disunion, 1854 to 1861. So you can really feel the build-up to the Civil War during this chapter. The North really solidifies in its hatred of slavery, and the South really solidifies in its fervent defense of slavery in this chapter. And you can see it's a very common essay topic is what are the causes of the Civil War? Well, we already talked about the Mexican-American War in chapter 18. Now in chapter 19 you see the aftermath, and there's several causes of the Civil War that occur during this chapter. The first, the really big one, is the publication of a novel. It's not even a work of nonfiction, it's a novel written by a woman too, and this is the time period when, let's face it, women weren't literary giants and weren't causing a whole lot of societal change, and yet this woman right here, Harriet Beecher Stowe, she's one of the major causes of the Civil War. She writes a book by the name of Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's an anti-slavery novel. She's an abolitionist. She has a brother and a father, I think, who are ministers or preachers who are part of this Second Great Awakening movement. And it's a great book. And I have here the quote, although I forgot to put the end quotes there. No other novel in American history, perhaps in all history, can be compared with it as a political force. That's a bold statement by your book, The Pageant, but I agree with it. You look before this book, you had some very fervent abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, obviously Harriet Beecher Stowe, but that's not the main viewpoint of most Northerners. Most Northerners hadn't even seen black people, knew that slavery existed in the South, but it didn't really affect them on a day-to-day basis, so they really didn't have a strong viewpoint towards it. They read Uncle Tom's Cabin, and at the end, they come out at the other end of that book as very, very angry abolitionists. And it's amazing that one novel, remember, this is a piece of fiction, that one piece of fiction can change the lives of so many people, so many views. It's a huge book in American and probably world history. It's so big that Abraham Lincoln is at a dinner party, I think in 1862 if I remember right. It's during the Civil War, and Harriet Beecher Stowe is apparently a guest or invited to this, and so President Lincoln goes up to her, and he has this quote that you see here. So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war. I mean, what a it's like a backhanded compliment, because all the people who die in the Civil War, and yet what a righteous war it ends up being. And it's righteous because of the cause that Harriet Beecher Stowe is proclaiming in that book, and that's anti-slavery. The book itself, and this is a picture of Harriet at the time she wrote the book, and this is a couple years before her death. So the book here, Uncle Tom's Cabin, it tells the story of a slave. His name is Uncle Tom, and he starts off in one of the northern border states that has slavery. And in actuality, slave life is kind of good. I don't want to say good. It doesn't seem all that bad early on. And through a series of events, I don't want to ruin it for you because I hope you read it. But through a series of unfortunate events, Tom keeps getting sold ever farther south. And at the end, he's in the hands of this absolutely evil person by the name of Simon Legree. He's one of the great villains ever in any type of literature. And Tom dies. And it's a pretty horrific, violent death. And it's just a very graphic novel. It also has massive amounts of religious symbolism. I mean, Uncle Tom really is a Christ-like figure with the stuff that he says and the trials. They're almost like stations of the cross in the various events towards the end of the book that he has to undergo. And his death is a very selfless act, and it's a very defiant act on his part. And so I'm giving you a little caption here from Uncle Tom's Cabin because, and it's weird how important this book is, and yet the term Uncle Tom, right, which is really a racial epithet that African Americans give to other African Americans, that they're sellouts, or that they act too white, right? If you do that, then you're quote unquote an Uncle Tom. And I really think that it's wrong. Right? It's not just wrong to make fun of somebody, but that's not at all what Uncle Tom in the book was like. If anything, Uncle Tom ends up being the most defiant person possible against his white master. And he's beaten to death at the end of the novel. And there are other slaves that beat him to death, but they're at the direction of Simon Legree, the white master. But they don't beat Tom to death because he's a sellout to white people, uh, or that he's too nice to white people, or that he acts too white. They beat Tom to death because Uncle Tom helped two other African American slaves to escape, and everybody knew that Uncle Tom did this, and so then they interrogated him to try and get him to, confess and to help them find these two slaves. And what does Tom do? He refuses. He refuses to help his white master recapture the other two slaves. So it's just the opposite of being a sellout, right? I mean, he's defending his race, and then the quote is, this is a quote from Uncle Tom right before they beat him to death. And it has here, "Master, if you were sick or in trouble or dying, I could save you. I'd give you my heart's blood. And if taking every drop of blood in this poor old body would save your precious soul, I'd give him freely as the Lord gave his for me. Oh, master, don't bring this great sin on your soul. It will hurt you more than it will me. Do the worst you can. My troubles be over soon. But if you don't repent, yours won't never end." So Tom here, he's not just begging for his life. He's actually begging for his master's soul. That if Simon Legree does this act, that Tom's actually going to a better place, heaven. Whereas Legree is, probably signing his soul over to the devil. I mean, this is Christ-like activity where he's actually, trying to protect the very individual who's, going to murder him. And the reason for the murder is that Tom won't, sell out to his fellow African Americans. So that's what I mean. That the word Uncle Tom is so different than the popular use of the term Uncle Tom. They're almost antonyms as opposed to synonyms. So that's just a little, soliloquy on my. Now the North and the South contest for Kansas. Northern abolitionists. So we talked about before in the last lecture, Stephen R. Douglas, right? He's going to set up the popular sovereignty out west, right? And the idea was that Kansas was going to be settled by Missourians who were pro-slave, and Nebraska was going to be settled by free soilers from Iowa. Well, it doesn't really work out that way because this has such bad public opinion, this whole popular sovereignty idea and splitting the territory, and people's viewpoints in the aftermath, really, of Uncle Tom's Cabin and some other instances become so solidified that everybody's trying to do whatever it can to protect their viewpoints. And this is what happens in Kansas. So Northern abolitionists start to finance groups. So they almost be like lobbying groups. They pour money and they get groups of people who agree with their opinion, and then they move to Kansas. So they're not people who are looking to farm in Kansas. They're abolitionists who are moving to Kansas for the sole task of getting Kansas as a free state, which would throw off the balance, right? Because Kansas is supposed to be a slave state under the plan. Southerners cry foul, so they do the exact same thing. So you have all these abolitionists and pro-slavery forces just flooding into Kansas. The ironic thing is nobody's bringing any slaves. They're just bringing their guns and their opinions. And so you can see here in the census of 1860, there are 107,000 whites, right? Lots of them pro-slavery, lots of them anti-slavery, and a whopping total of 2 blacks. Nebraska had 15 blacks and something like 100,000 whites. So they're fighting over a fictitious slave, right? I mean, there's not going to be any slavery in Kansas from a practical standpoint, and yet lots of people die and bloodshed starts in Kansas as a result of these fictitious slaves. So on election day in 1855, and it was for the colonial legislature, and then again this colonial legislature then would draft up their constitution and submit it for admission into the country. So obviously the people who are running for the legislature are going to be either pro-slave or anti-slave. Well, on election day for this legislators, a bunch of pro-slavery, quote, border ruffians jumps the border from Missouri and pulls the Chicago move, right? They vote early and often. So the same guy, he votes several times that day. And as a result, the pro-slavery forces win in Missouri. And the pro-slavery forces then set up their I do have colonial there. It should be territorial legislature. And the Free Soilers, of course, cry foul, and they set up their own government in Topeka. So you actually have two governments in Kansas in the aftermath of 1855 who are both claiming to be the legitimate government with their own governors, their own legislatures, and each of them absolutely despises the other one, right? Because you have one pro-slave, one pro-free. So that does not make itself. I mean, it's going to be a civil war, right? You can't help that when you have two individuals claiming that they are. So here's a photo. Unofficial armies form, and you get a bunch of dudes here with their guns and their top hats and their log cabins. This looks like a typical house in Beverly, if you ask me. And they start to fight each other. So this we get to now John Brown and the Potawatomi Massacre. We're going to watch a documentary about this in class, actually, because it's a pretty cool story. So in Lawrence, Kansas, it ends up being a free soil town. So it's a bunch of abolitionists are the ones that are living there. A posse of 800 pro-slavery men invade the town. So these are Kansas on Kansas crime. They attack the town. They burn down a bunch of buildings. They fire some cannons. They basically just, cause a big ruckus in town. John Brown is one of the abolitionists in Kansas. Now, he's not in Lawrence at the time, but he hears about it, and he completely loses his mind. So he wants revenge. Good old-fashioned revenge. So he hears word that down in Potawatomi, there is a cabin, and it's kind of isolated from other people. And in this cabin are several pro-slavery individuals. So John Brown and his supporters, they sneak up to this cabin in the middle of the night, and they proceed to butcher these individuals. They actually chop them into little pieces with swords. Obviously, news gets out of this atrocity. John Brown is forced to flee, so he goes out back east, and the violence of Lawrence, Kansas, and the Potawatomi Massacre erupts into essentially full-scale warfare within the borders of Kansas. So it's been said, and I think accurately, that the Civil War doesn't really start in 1861 and with the bombing of Fort Sumter. It really starts in 1856 in the aftermath of the election of the territorial legislature in Kansas, because there's constant fighting between pro-slavery and anti-slavery in Kansas from 1856 all the way until 1865. It just expands to the rest of the country in 1861. This is just a map from your book about the Kansas situation, and you can see here most of the people, they're not there to stay in Kansas for good. They're just there to prove their opinion, whether it be pro-slavery or anti-slavery. So they're just kind of hopping across the border and forming the towns there. So you can see here, this is Topeka, there's Lecompton, there's Lawrence, and then the Osawatomie, Potawatomi Creek massacres down here. Right? You can see attacks by free and pro-slavery. They're all over the place. All right. There's not just violence in Kansas. There's also violence in the United States Senate that same year. So you got Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, who was an abolitionist. He gives a speech, and he's pissed off about the events in Kansas, and he starts to essentially make fun of the Southerners for being retarded, for acting like idiots as they support slavery. Congressman, so this would be somebody from the House of Representatives, he hears about this and he becomes enraged. Right? Southern hillbilly hothead. And so he sneaks up behind Sumner several days later and beats the ever-living crap out of Sumner's head with his cane until the cane finally breaks, and I guess they drag off this Preston S. Brooks off him. Now Sumner, his skull is cracked, and he suffers brain damage. Sumner is forced to travel to Europe to obtain medical treatment, and he's in treatment for several years until he finally makes his way back to the United States. Massachusetts is so pissed off at this that they leave. They don't pick a new guy. They leave his seat like they just wait for Sumner. He's almost treated like a martyr. And South Carolina, of course, responds. Even though Preston S. Brooks was forced to resign, South Carolina immediately reelects him into Congress. So you have this big fight that's happening where the South basically says, yeah, it's okay that Brooks did this and we agree with it, so we're sending him back. This is a political cartoon you see in your book. You also see it on the AP test every once in a while of the attack. And it has here, obviously this is a pro-North statement. Here's Charles Sumner, right, writing with a quill pen, and here's Preston S. Brooks attacking him with the cane. And then it's like making a mockery of Southern chivalry, argument versus clubs. So in other words, the civilized way of doing things is to argue, right, with pen and quill and oratory, and the Southern chivalrous way to argue is to attack each other with clubs. Brings us to the election of 1856. You can see now this is clearly a North versus South thing. You got the Democrats their candidate is James Buchanan. Now the Whigs basically are dead since they lose the election of 1848, 1852. They kind of just dissipate, and a bunch of other single issue and small issue parties kind of reform under the Republican Party. And the Republican Party's main platform, although they had lots of other stuff, but their main platform was they were against the expansion of slavery in the territories. So they present their first candidate, Fremont. Remember that guy from California that had founded the California Golden Bear Republic? Well, that's the guy that they picked. And he loses. Right? At this point, the Republican Party doesn't have the infrastructure that it does just 4 years later, and also the opinion in the border regions there, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Virginia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, those states that are Democrat, they're still unwilling to take such an abolitionist stance. Right? The slavery is legal in some of those, and you have like the butternut region of Illinois and Indiana, where it's still a lot of pro-slavery elements. So as a result of that, Buchanan wins. And then that's it for Buchanan. He doesn't do jack for the rest of his 4 years. He's one of the more useless presidents in American history. Dred Scott. So I'm having you guys read Dred Scott, or you already read Dred Scott, but I think it's important that we talk about it now. And so here we go. Dred Scott versus Stanford. We already read the facts in class. We talked about it, but I want you to review it one more time. The Supreme Court ruled that Dred Scott was a slave and not a citizen, and therefore he could not sue in federal court. The case should end there. Right? It's racist, but I think we understand with Southerners on the Supreme Court that they were going to rule against the African American. Right? So I think we would recognize if it's law, it's not right, but if it's law that African Americans can be slaves, and a slave therefore could not be a citizen, and only citizens are allowed to sue, that makes sense that Dred Scott should lose, right? Because he doesn't have standing to sue in court. Again, a racist decision, but at least logically it makes sense if you're pro-slavery. However, then the court really screws up, because the opinion should end there. But then in dicta, which is basically like extra that the court says that really isn't enforceable, and they really shouldn't say it at all, but they just can't help themselves. They're lawyers. What do you want? The court then states in dicta that because a slave was private property, he could be taken into any territory and legally held there in slavery. So you could take him all the way to Maine, you could take him to Massachusetts, you could take him to Illinois. It doesn't matter where you take your slave. And the idea is that the Fifth Amendment prohibits the government from taking away your life, liberty, or property without due process. And if we're going to consider a slave to be property, then you should be allowed to take your property wherever you want to. Just like you should be able to take your horse, right? Your horse is your property. You should be able to take your car, because your car is your property, wherever you want to in the country, and they can't take it away from you. Therefore, you should be able to take your slave wherever. So, in essence, this declares slavery legal everywhere. So we're no more balance with the states, no more popular sovereignty. Forget you Republicans and free soilers. Doesn't matter. Slavery is legal everywhere. All right. The court further says the Congress had no power to ban slavery from territories, regardless of what the people in the territories might want. And it's because they're protecting the minority rights of those very, very few slave owners. How kind of the court to protect the minority rights of slave owners. The irony there is ridiculous. Obviously, the North absolutely hates the Dred Scott decision. The South loves it, and it's, again, one of the causes of the Civil War. Another kind of cause, I guess you'd say, or it gives the South false sense of worth, is the financial panic of 1857. So we've already talked about two financial panics now, right? The financial panic of 1819, which dealt with overspeculation in Western lands. The Panic of 1837, which was as a result of the death of the National Bank, and of course, because then there's the overspeculation in Western lands with the wildcat banks and all the pet banks and all this other stuff. Then 20 years later, because again, these panics happen pretty regularly on a 20-year or so cycle. And that's what capitalism is. You have, it's like a roller coaster where you have its heights where everybody's making a ton of money, and then you have its depths where lots of people are, declaring bankruptcy and losing jobs and stuff like that. It's the cyclical way of capitalism. And, we're definitely feeling it in the 1800s. And every 20 years or so, we're at the dip. And so here's one of the dips. Kind of happens because all that gold that they find in California, it makes its way in the money supply. And anytime you're increasing the money supply, you're going to have something called inflation. And inflation can be good if you are a debtor, but bad if you're a creditor. Right? And here's what I mean by that. So let's say you obtain a loan for $100,000. Okay? Now you're going to have to pay back $100,000 plus interest. Now what if there's inflation? Right? And it goes up 100%. So now when you repay back that $100,000, in reality it's only worth $50,000 because of the rate of inflation has increased so much. So people who are in debt tend to love inflation. But the people who are owed money, they would love actually deflation if they could get it. So the kind of wild inflation of currency can cause a recession. Right? In addition to that, too much grain was grown in the period of 1853 to 1856 because of the Crimean War. You have all these British soldiers and all these Russian soldiers fighting each other, right, in Europe. And because they're fighting each other, they're not growing crops. They need to feed these soldiers, so these two countries purchase the grain for their countries from the United States. And so the price of grain goes up in the United States, and so farmers plant more and more and more of it, right? And they're making a lot of money. They're short-sighted, and the best way to grow more grain is to purchase more land. So then you get an overspeculation of land. People buy too much land. And this is also the time period where everybody's building a railroad. Now we got the one transcontinental railroad being built, but there's railroads all over the East Coast and the Midwest being built by private corporations. Sometimes they're the exact same railroad, several miles apart, but going to the same destination and origination. So obviously they're going to, compete with each other. And there's a lot of overhead to build a railroad. And so you have to borrow large amounts of money. So because of these reasons, you get a recession. It's the financial crash of 1857. Now, who's hit the hardest? The North, because that's who are engaging in all the finance, which affects the currency and the inflation. They're the ones that are growing the grain, which deals with then the price drops once those soldiers in Europe. Once the war is over, then they go back and they can feed themselves. And also over speculation of land, because they purchased more land and went into debt to purchase this stuff. And of course, the railroads are the North too. So the North is hit pretty bad by this financial panic. The South, though, doesn't have to deal with any of this stuff, because what do the South do? Grow cotton. They're also having great crops at the time period, and the rest of the world is purchasing Southern cotton. So the people who who are involved in the cotton industry, which are the people who have money in the South, they actually come out of this recession smelling like a rose. And it gives them a false sense of strength, that they believe cotton is king. And so they grow more cotton. And this actually ends up being stupid, because they grow lots of cotton from this time period, from like 1855 to 1860 or so. And then once the war starts, and the naval blockade begins, the Europe doesn't really need to purchase a whole lot of cotton, because they still have a ton sitting in their warehouses. Our guy, Abe Lincoln. This is one of the younger pictures of him. He kind of bursts onto the scene. Remember, we talked a little bit about him with the spot resolutions when he was just in the House of Representatives, even less about him when he was a soldier in the Black Hawk Wars. Well, now he's trying to get a big boy job in government now. And he's running for Senate in Illinois, so to be one of the 2 Illinois senators. He's running for election in 1858, and he's challenging the little giant, right? The guy we've talked a lot about lately, Stephen A. Douglas. I think I might have called him Stephen R. Douglas before. Doesn't matter. Stephen Douglas challenges him to a series of debates, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which even the dumb kids in this class should have at least heard about them growing up. And we're going to talk about the subject matter now. So the biggest thing to know about the Lincoln-Douglas debates is that it provides a venue for Lincoln to show how nationally appealing that he is, and it also is a full kind of national discussion of the notion of popular sovereignty, of which Stephen A. Douglas, is champion. In Freeport, Illinois, home of the pretzels, the Freepoint Doctrine is enunciated by Douglas, and he argues that no matter how the Supreme Court ruled, think Dred Scott, slavery would stay down if the people voted it down. Here's why. Laws that protect slavery would have to be passed by the territorial legislatures. And if the public doesn't support a law, then it's impossible to enforce the law. So what Douglas does here is he pisses off both the Free Soilers and also the pro-slavery forces, because both sides want to either destroy slavery or protect it for all time. And here Douglas is saying it doesn't matter, just whatever people want, that's what they'll get. So even though Douglas wins the Senate campaign, and he becomes the senator from Illinois in 1858, Lincoln's opposition to this doctrine and his eloquent way that he handles himself, he becomes very, very nationally known, especially within Republican circles. And so people start to look towards him as a viable candidate for the Republican nomination for president in 1860. This brings us back to John Brown. Remember, he was the guy that hacked off the arms and legs of 5 pro-slavery people back in Kansas. Well, now it's a couple years later. He's grown this big long beard because he's kind of a wanted man, so he's kind of in hiding. And his idea is that he's going to attack this federal arsenal, a place where they store weapons. And he's going to take the weapons, and he's going to arm both his supporters, the abolitionists, and also arm the local slaves. And he's going to create this little sanctuary where slaves could escape to within the South. So he attacks the federal arsenal. He kills a few people, including a free African American, oddly enough, or ironically enough, and he's captured. Right, his son's basically shot right in front of him. He's shot at least once, maybe twice. He's very, near death, but he goes on trial, and he realizes that he's guilty and he's gonna die. So he turns the trial into just a show trial where he can try and put forth his views on the evils of slavery. So he's eventually hanged. the most important thing about the attack on Harpers Ferry is how the nation responds to it. The South becomes extremely pissed that a guy would even attempt to do this. They feel like now he's just the first of many people who are going to attempt violent insurrections and trying to arm their slaves. So they become very, very hostile towards abolitionists in the North. Moderate Northerners were kind of put off by this notion that we're devolving into ever more violence, because they knew that John Brown was a kook. And then the abolitionists, they view John Brown as a martyr, and they're infuriated by his execution. They think he just basically floats right into heaven, and they sing lots of songs during the Civil War that are based on the life and death of John Brown. This is the painting from your book that talks about the last moments of John Brown. Here he is. He's got that long, flowing white beard, and of course he's kissing a little black baby on his way to the gallows. So we come now to the presidential election of 1860. Obviously, we know Lincoln wins, right? That's not going to be a big surprise. But what is the Republican platform? It's not purely anti-slavery, because remember, they're not against the immediate emancipation of all African Americans, because that's more of a William Lloyd Garrison, fervent abolitionist thing. The Republicans, they're moderate abolitionists, we'll say. So they kind of take on old Free Soilers. The Free Soil Party kind of dissolves into nothingness in the 1850s, and the people who are Free Soilers become Republicans. So they're against the non-extension of slavery. What I mean by that is they're against extension of slavery into any of the territories. So kind of a Wilmot Proviso type notion. They're in favor of a protective tariff. Ooh, this sounds like the good old Whigs, right? So northern manufacturers who were supportive of the Whigs, who really were supportive of the Federalists a long, long time ago, they are in favor of this plank in the Republican platform. No abridgment of rights. So this is the anti know-nothing party type stance. So whereas the know-nothing party from the 1840s and 50s was against immigrants and against allowing them to vote and have jobs and stuff like that, the Republican Party says, hey, Irish people, German people, come on into the party. And so it appeals to immigrants. They're in favor of the Pacific Railroad. So in other words, a northern trip of the Transcontinental Railroad. So the Northwest, right, all those areas that the railroad would go through, they're also going to be supported by the Republican platform. A lot of this, right, involves infrastructure. So internal improvements at federal expense. So this is now the western states are going to be in favor of this because they need those railroads, they need those roads, they need the canals, they need all that stuff that that society needs, and they don't have the money for it. But if the federal government foots the bill, then they're all for it, right? So the western states are going to be appeased in this plank. And of course, free homesteads from the public domain. Farmers have a chance to get free land. So there's that manifest destiny, move west, get new land. If you run out of land, if you run out of land where you're at, you can just move west to ever more land. So this is going to appease farmers, but also a lot of those immigrants who didn't have a whole lot of money. And as long as they can get west, they can get some land. This is just a cartoon from your book showing how Abraham Lincoln's looking like against his candidate opponents there. This is supposed to be one of the first pictorial visions of baseball. This is right around the time that baseball was being invented at this time. There were different clubs around the country. Okay, so here's the table of the election results, and you can see Lincoln wins there, but he only gets 39, actually almost 40% of the popular vote. So he gets 180 electoral votes. Then you see Douglas, his old foe from Illinois, gets 29% of the votes. He was running on the Democrat. And then you got Breckinridge, and the Democrat Party splits here. And what they do is you have like the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. So this Breckinridge guy gets all of the cotton states, it says there. Those are the Southern ones. And then Bell, who's just, don't worry, you'll never hear of him again. What you need to take from this table is that Abraham Lincoln truly is a minority president. He doesn't even come close to being the choice of half of America, right? He's only the choice of about 40% of America. And so he does not have a mandate to do what he wants. He's in a very bad pickle. This is just a map, and you can see here that Lincoln gets all of the northern states. Breckinridge gets all of the southern states. And then you can see Bell and Douglas. So it's funny when you see that Douglas comes in second place, but as far as the electoral votes, you can see he comes in absolute last place because he's right. He's getting a lot of popular votes, but not enough, and that's a flaw, you could say, in the winner-take-all system of the Electoral College. But we'll talk about that next year in AP Government. This is a little bit better map down here, and it gives you an idea of where in the country the different candidates are getting their support. So you can see that even though Lincoln's from Illinois, he's really only pulling in votes from the northern half. Douglas was very popular in the southern half, and those are those butternut individuals. And you can see, obviously, once you get the deep south, it's going to be Breckinridge all day long. Okay, so we get the first states that attempt to leave the Union. South Carolina votes to secede in December 1860, so about a month and a half or so after Lincoln is elected. Remember, he's not sworn in yet. They secede, and that'll be the topic of our debate this week, I guess. And very, very shortly, within a few weeks, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas also secede. They form something called the Confederate States of America in February 1861. This is still now a month before Lincoln takes office. And they elect as their president a guy by the name of Jefferson Davis. And there's a picture of him there down in the lower right. So there's still several states who are slave states that have remained in the Union, who are just kind of in a wait-and-see approach to see what the United States of America does in response to the secession. The biggest one is probably Virginia, right? I mean, Virginia is so close to the capital. It involves so many close government workers, and it was always up until this time. Let's face it, most of the presidents have come from Virginia. It's probably the most important state historically from the Revolution all the way up to 1860. So a lot of people are waiting and watching to see what's Virginia going to do. Here you can see a map from their book. It talks about who is in favor of secession. Interesting thing you're going to see here is there's no big surprise, right? Virginia ends up seceding. However, up in the mountains, the Appalachian area here, there's very they against secession, and so during the Civil War, the western and northern portion of Virginia secedes from the other part of Virginia. So you have Virginia secedes first, and then West Virginia secedes from northern Virginia, and that's where West Virginia comes from. There was like a last-ditch effort by members of the government to try and fix this in the aftermath of Lincoln's election, and they're called the Crittenden Amendments. Very rarely tested on, but it might be something cool to throw in an essay. And it was meant to try and appease the South, to try and get the South to come back into the Union. And we're going right back to the Missouri Compromise, where slavery is going to be prohibited north of 36 degrees 30, the federal protection of slavery south of that line. So states that have slavery, there's no way that anybody can take anything away from them. Popular sovereignty in future states. So this is the kind of the Douglas approach in the territories. And Lincoln says, no, we're not dealing with that. That all that type of compromise is passed. This is kind of like a Henry Clay type compromise. The only problem is Henry Clay is dead, so it just doesn't work. This is just a picture of the states, and you can see here. It's funny. You can tell it's contemporary because they have here Maryland bad egg. Well, Maryland ends up sticking with the Union. So it's kind of funny. And here's the last slide. You have here the infamous Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852. You get the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. You get the beatdown that Brooks gives Sumner in the Senate in 1856. You also get the Potawatomi Massacre. Civil War begins really in Kansas in 1856. The Dred Scott decision in 1857. Then you get the Panic of 1857, the Tariff of 1857, the Lincoln-Douglas debates 1858, the Raid on Harpers Ferry by John Brown 1859, and then Lincoln's election in 1860, along with the secession of some of the southern states led by South Carolina, and the formation of the Confederate States of America in 1861. The next chapter, lots of war, a lot of battles.